recorded live.
Hello and welcome to the Castle of Horror interview segment where we talk to writers and creators of today's genre worlds from Denver, Colorado. I'm your host, Jason Henderson, creator with Tony Salvaggio of the steampunk graphic novel CLOCKWERX, out now in paperbacks from Humanoids. And this week, actually, I have dug deep into my own Rolodex, or rather Tony's in my Rolodex, and with us, Joe Witherington currently works in the marketing department. He is representing marketing today of Humanoids Publishing, working with the press to facilitate reviews, coverage, and more while marketing the Humanoids brand. Joe also contributes to Humanoids' social media presence online, as well as their blog, while creating and running book campaigns. So he's a lifelong fan of comics. He is deeply embedded in the comics industry. I have an angle on him because he and I have been working together closely to do marketing. And I thought it would be really cool to bring on an expert, like an on-the-ground, in-the-trenches expert on marketing comics today, and talk about how the industry has changed and what sort of challenges meet a comic book creator, for those of you out there listening who want to get into creating comics. So, Joe, that's well. First of all, welcome. I'm so glad that you could be here.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
Absolutely. All right. Like I said, wanted to be on. Wanted to hear more about the particular challenges of working on a book today. So, give me for instance. We're now this month. You're working for Humanoids. You're putting out a number of books. I'm going to ask you in a minute about Humanoids, but first, you got several books out this month. One of them is CLOCKWERX. So give me an example of how marketing with a particular book like CLOCKWERX happens and the stuff that you need to pay attention to and think about.
Well, every book is its own, beast, basically. And that's what I meant about, like, book campaigns, as you kind of have to build entire campaigns catered around the book, your potential audience, and in that genre as a whole. Because not only do you want to reach the people who are already reading Humanoids in general, but you want to reach the new readers who have never heard about Humanoids but may be interested in your genre specifically. So a book like CLOCKWERX, which can appeal to action, adventure, but obviously we have that whole niche steampunk audience now. And obviously in the last couple of years, that audience has grown tremendously. And with a title like CLOCKWERX, we really wanted to kind of cater to that, and seeing that CLOCKWERX is an all-ages, young adult title, that we could really kind of boost the message out there and get it out there to kind of put more readers on eyes on CLOCKWERX. But, we also have another book out this month called Cardigo, which is an eco-thriller, and that would have an entirely different type of audience, more catered to thriller, again, in the eco-horror type thing. So it's two entirely different genres, and so sometimes balancing campaigns, you have to be very careful not to oversaturate your general audience while still taking care of the individual audience.
Sure.
So it's a lot of balancing.
So what? Go ahead.
Go on. No, you go on.
Well, I was just thinking about like what you had to do with, you talk about these campaigns and like steampunk, for instance. I think when Tony and I first started coming up with this particular idea, that word didn't exist. Cyberpunk existed. But the phrase steampunk has really kind of, it probably had been introduced by then, but it hadn't sort of melted. You couldn't write a script and say, what kind of script is this? Is a steampunk script. The closest you'd be able to say is, this is a science fiction script. And that's come around. But now it's this big, it's not just a genre, it's sort of a community and a way of life. So what have you done to try to figure out how to market towards that particular community?
Well, the one thing that the steampunk community is really known for is their creativity. And as you said, it is a community. It is a very close-knit group of people, whether it's local, whether it's statewide, whether it's worldwide. People using the internet will do meetups, they'll go to conventions, they'll fly across the country. And a big aspect to that is their love of costuming, and they really try to kind of combine, the old steampunk genre with the costumes, and you'll see steampunk versions of very famous characters, and more often you'll see completely original, creations based on a what if, this existed then.
Sure.
And, so we
like
tried to...
Steampunk Joker, yeah.
Yeah.
No,
I think the very first thing where I saw steampunk was like a steampunk Star Wars set of drawings and figures. And that was kind of like where I realized steampunk had it made it. It become pop culture. And so one of the things we want to do is try and capitalize on that, and that's why we created the Show Us Your Clock campaign. Not to become,
okay, let me say this again. Let me see if I understand. This is the Show Us Your Clock. Hashtag.
Yes. Please,
Show Us Your Clock.
Do not forget the L. That is a clock.
Right. Yes. Okay. Yes. Show Us Your Clock. But this is a creative competition.
Yes, and that is, we're trying to encourage people who are involved in that steampunk community to show us what they got. Show us your, we kind of wanted to push it towards, because in the book they call your mecha robots clocks. Yeah. These things. Yeah. And we're not limiting it to just clocks. It's clocks, it's suits of armor, it's your best steampunk outfit. We want to see what steampunk means. Yeah, and we want to see what steampunk means to you. Whether it's on a personal level, professional level, what is it, And so we're trying to encourage people to show us their love of design in costuming, whether it's actual costumes, whether it's just designs that are on paper, and show us what it means to you. And you can win a signed copy of CLOCKWERX from both you and Tony.
Cool. Very, very cool. I actually think that's really exciting. I mean, and to be honest with you, I've worked with a lot of publishers, and I've never seen this sort of social media outreach, but I think it is something that's changed over time. Like if you and I were working on releasing a book 10 years ago or 15 years ago, there are certain avenues that would be closed to us, right? I mean, you wouldn't have, there's no such thing as Facebook. There's no such thing as Twitter. There's no Instagram. It's all you have is directly marketing to the direct sales market.
So direct sales market,
yeah,
it's a whole different monster. And even if you want to do anything like that using the internet, you had to go on message boards. But like you said, it was mostly reaching out to the direct market, contacting retailers, and getting them on board with it. Nowadays, we've gone so far in 10 years. I mean, we've already skipped things. A lot of retailers and publishers are even kind of moving away from like their .com websites. I mean, of course, everybody has a website still, but you're seeing more and more focus in terms of advertising being put into social media, whether it's Facebook, Tumblr, or the one that's really growing quickly, and it's Instagram. We're seeing huge traction on Instagram, and it's a less is more approach. Something as simple as taking a small panel from just one panel from CLOCKWERX, and putting it out there gets more reach and shares and likes and retweets than a 4-page preview did, 2 years ago on Facebook.
Right.
It's so weird. It's the I don't want to say ADD generation, but people we're busy, and so you don't have a lot of time to dedicate. So what we do when we're looking at our phones, we're scrolling through, and if it's something you can quickly like and share, and that can go viral, that's the way to do it, as opposed to actually having to stop and read things.
Wow. Well, I mean, I can understand that also because a screenshot is more about kind of an idea, like something sort of aspirational. Is this the kind of thing, this image that I show you, whether it's an image of like the shipwreck in CLOCKWERX or the giant robots, racing through London or whatever it is. If I show you a single image, it asks you, is this the kind of thing that you want to associate yourself with or not? And that's what's so strange about selling art on social media is that suddenly the artist is in sort of an intimate conversation with the listener, with them going, do I want to be part of this or not? I find that fascinating. I'm sort of amazed at what you guys are doing. Gosh, so I wanted to ask you about Humanoids. Like CLOCKWERX, just so people know, is coming from Humanoids. It's in paperback, in the mass market. So you can get it in bookstores and
Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, anywhere that Ingram basically distributes to.
Right, and for those who don't know, Ingram is the distributor generally to the mass market. It's if you go to a Barnes & Noble, chances are they get their books from Ingram. If you go to any Books A Million, that's where they get their books. And this is different from the comic book direct market. So we're and of course you've got Amazon. You've always got Amazon. But Amazon is so easy to link to that I often link to them. But anyway, Humanoids does comics but I think they're probably more well known overseas. Can you explain, like, who is Humanoids to somebody who's generally like a Big Two fan?
Humanoids obviously has its roots in European comics, like you said. We were a French publisher that were started by a couple guys, up and coming guys you may have heard of, like Mobius, Jean-Pierre Dionnet, and several other amazingly talented people who wanted to publish their own visions, and they created Metal Hurlant magazine, and which most U.S. people would be familiar with when National Lampoon started translating it as Heavy Metal magazine. And so, a lot of that all comes from there, and in fact, Heavy Metal today and Humanoids, still friends. So European comics.
That's very strange to me, by the way, that Metal Hurlant, or whatever it is, came out in French, and then you had an American Heavy Metal, and then for a short time you literally had both of them on the American stage.
Yes.
With both Heavy Metal and Metal Hurlant. Yeah, absolutely.
And Metal Hurlant, it basically translates to screaming metal, and it's screaming metal. So they basically said, that doesn't work, so let's go with heavy, and so that's where the change came from. But there's this whole art scene in France, and to the point where they take comic books so seriously that it's referred to as the ninth art. And it's huge over there, and so there's this whole market of comic books, this wonderful world that didn't really get a chance to be seen over here. And so Humanoids eventually opened up a U.S. branch and started publishing directly over here. So we're more than just a French publisher; we're an international publisher. We publish in U.S., we publish in the U.K., we publish in France, and we publish in Japan. In fact, we actually had The Tipping Point came out earlier this year, and it came out in all 4 countries,
Wow.
and in 3 different languages, Well,
I think that CLOCKWERX is already in certainly French, but also Spanish, and I know there's an Italian version. I know there's a German version.
Well, there are certain markets that we don't publish directly in, so we'll license out the material, and that's what happened with like the German version and whatnot. So there were other publishers involved, but it just shows the demand, that in other parts of the world that there's a demand for these types of stories, like CLOCKWERX, and CLOCKWERX is one of the funny ones because it was written by you and Tony to English-speaking guys, and then translated into French. And then translated back into English.
The
the
translation that we got in English, by the way, the one that you're talking about was like, and I mean no disrespect, it really was like it went through like Google Translate, like from the French just into English. It was
because they take it more of a direct route, and that's why usually there's a translation team, and then they have somebody adapt it afterwards.
Yeah.
And
which is what we
you guys technically did the adaptation of it. You readapted your own material, and it was best to do that because that way we kept the original voice in there.
That's very kind. Yeah, I mean, it turns out I sort of love it because it just to track it. Tony and I originally wrote it as a screenplay, sold it to Humanoids to be a French comic. So we translated it from an English screenplay into an English comic, which Humanoids then did a translation and adaptation of their own, turning it into a French comic, which then got, published. And then they sent us a translation, which we did, another adaptation of. So what you're looking at now is an adaptation of a French translation of an English adaptation of an original English screenplay. And we sort of get on and off the train at various points in that. It's the weirdest origin for a story I've ever heard. I mean,
it's more complex than the clocks in the book themselves.
I love. By the way, Tony was the one. Just so you know, I mean, there are a lot of wonderful images where you have the pilots like inside the clocks, during the fights, because the idea is they get into the cockpit, which is the central sort of belly of the clock, and control it. And we get into that a lot in the comic, but we had so many schematics. I mean, there's so much deeper, in theory, that we could have gone if we had the room, because Tony had figured out how these things worked, down down to the smallest detail. It was pretty amazing. So, okay, well, anyway, I appreciate that with you introducing Humanoids to the world. One thing I noticed, though, is like if you get this is a mass market Humanoids paperback, it's still a bigger size than a typical comic book paperback. Like a typical Batman paperback or something like that is, I'm going to guess, 6.5 by 10 or something. And this is something closer to, I don't know, 6.5 by 11 maybe. It's wider than a typical comic. Those differences, where do they come from, and does it change? Is there anything different in how these comics are produced? I ask as a leading question because I suspect there is. But
yes,
go ahead.
You are completely right. In Europe, they do have their own sizing. Just like, Americans with inches, and then you got everyone else using centimeters. There are similar situations like that. The ratios are a lot different. The newsstands, the way they put the books out in France are a little bit different. So we publish closer to the traditional European size for the most part. So for there, you'd think most people are like, oh, well, what's the big deal? Just resize them. But you lose a lot to the aspect ratio, and a lot of the artists draw in that format specifically. So what happens is say if we were to take a book like The Incall, which is obviously one of Humanoid's most famous titles, Mobius and Jodorowsky, if we were to just print that in the exact same U.S. format, regular traditional floppy, which you pick up from DC Marvel, the margins on the left and right would be close to being normal, but the top and bottom would have 4 inches of white space.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's not as simple, and so we have to publish, to keep the aspect ratio and to stay true, we have to, publish in, like I said, closer to the European style. And because Jean-Baptiste Hostache did CLOCKWERX in the European style, obviously, it's a similar situation.
It's amazing. Jean-Baptiste Hostache, he really does sort of ring it out here. I mean, these are extraordinarily detailed drawings. I mean, if you take a typical American comic, and I love American comics, I still love them. And in many cases I love minimalist comics. But a typical American comic artist is expected to churn out about 22 pages a month. Presuming that he's an artist that we expect to carry one book, he needs to churn out 22 pages a month, which means about a page a day if he takes off the weekends, and has a couple extra books, extra pages turned in. I don't think that this could be done. I think this is a level of production that is just completely, I think, out of bounds with what you would do, if you had to churn out an issue every month. I mean, I assume you're right about that.
Every artist is different. Some can churn and burn them out. Some need more time. I mean, obviously, in dealing in the industry, we see it all the time. Marvel and DC constantly have to, because they have to solicit books so far out, a lot of times they slip, and it's no big deal these days when it's oh, this book got bumped a month or 2 weeks or whatever. Yeah. But you've also got artists that sometimes it's harder for them to, it takes a little bit longer for them to do their pages because you have distractions. I know several artists who literally have an office that they just drive to 15 minutes away from their house. Just that there's no internet, no nothing. They just go there and they draw just because they need no distractions. They got to get those 1 page a day at least.
Which is a heck of a lot because it's still 6 to 8 pictures, per page. It's amazing that you can do this much work and still have that much of an attention to detail about it. Let's see. I can't ask you about possibilities of sequels because that's not what we're about right now. We're trying to talk about the book, and we just don't know. So what? Okay, let me ask you this, and then I think we're good. If I'm a person out there in America and I'm thinking of breaking into comics, maybe because I read them when I was a kid, or maybe because I still read them, and I'm in college and I'm trying to figure out what to do. What advice would you have for that person? I mean, I'm sure you get a lot of emails like, "Hey, tell me what I should do to break in." Do you have any advice for that person, or is it untellable?
Well, there's no surefire way to do it. We're all different, and we're all looking for different things, and we all have a different style. Artists, obviously, it's a little bit easier because you can go to conventions, you can email your portfolio to a lot of publishers of just your work, and they can tell you in just a few minutes, is it what they're looking for, what kind of critiques and whatnot. Again, if you bump into a publisher at a convention, whether it's at a bar or whether it's at their booth, you can show them their work, and they can critique you in just a few minutes. And that's the great thing about being an artist because it's visual. So they're able to see it right there. You either got it or you don't. This is what we're looking for. This is not what we're looking for. With a writer, it's a lot harder because in order to showcase your style, they need to read what you write. And it's a trickier situation because if you send in an original story idea, this happens all the time in Hollywood. It's like, well, what if they pass on it, but because that editor read that story, it may influence another idea in another book. So a lot of publishers don't take cold submissions for that reason. So if you're a writer and you want to, showcase something, just reach out to the publisher individually and ask them if, say, you got a pitch or say you want to show writing samples. If it's a sample, that's a little bit easier because it's not like an actual story. But if you got a pitch, ask them how you want it presented because every publisher has different ways to do it. But again, an artist, you're in luck because much like the talent you probably have, it's a lot easier to get your foot in the door, but you're competing with a lot of other people. Writers, you got to keep writing, and you just got to somehow get your stuff in front of those publishers, but without them stealing ideas.
I gotta say, personally, I'm less worried about stealing ideas. I mean, I don't know. I don't believe that that's ever happened to me. But even if it has, it's not something that I've been all that concerned about. But I'm not at all dismissing what you're saying. It's like that one. I would say the bigger thing that I would totally agree with that you said is just how freaking hard it is to get your stuff in front of a publisher. If you're a writer, because if you're an artist, you can look right away and go, this woman really has it. She has an amazing hand. This guy really knows what he's doing. I can tell right off. Or, unfortunately, this isn't quite there yet. We're not. You can't do that with a script. There is no conceivable way to tell somebody's writing without actually bothering to read some of it, at least a page. And and I do tell writers often that you may well be tossed based on your first page. So you better make it good, because that may be the only thing they may bother to read is the first couple of paragraphs. So don't, it doesn't mean you have to jump straight to the action. It doesn't mean anything formulaic like that. But definitely you need to be engaging and not boring and not bad in that, right away. And it's still very hard. It's still way hard compared with portfolios. That's just one of the trade-offs.
Also, if you're an artist and you're showing to a publisher, make sure you've looked at the publisher's work, what they've published, and kind of cater to the type of stuff they do. Don't go to, Humanoids and showing all your Superman stuff. While it could look great, we're more interested in looking at seeing like a man and a woman sitting at a breakfast table and being able to tell from panel A to panel F what was going on in between them with no words. We want to see the hands, we want to see the expressions, we want to see the faces. But DC and Marvel would be looking more for the dynamics of the art. So it all depends.
Absolutely. Wow. There's a lot more that we could talk about with like the formatting of these. I remember one of the interesting things working with international teams, which is very common now in writing. When Tony and I were doing the script for CLOCKWERX, we had to make sure and sort of over-describe every panel and go, this is where the person's hand is, this is what they're doing, this is, so because not only do you run, even with a person who speaks the same language, it's very easy for the artist to like get the wrong idea from what you're describing and go off in a different direction. And that would normally be fine, but then it may be that a couple pages later it turns out it was important to like do something one way or the other. But when you introduce the language issue, it gets even worse, and you got to be super careful. All right, here's the funniest one I can think of, and this was not even in Humanoids. I once did a script. This was for Marvel, and the artist was in Spain. And I said, okay, these two girls, they're in their kitchen, and they're they just put down the groceries. They're eating and having some yogurt, that you eat with a spoon.
Yeah, like a Tobiani or the Greek yogurt or anything like that.
Yeah, the oikos or whatever. But when it came back from the script, the artist had drawn little Pepsi bottles with yogurt in them, because in Spain, that's how you have yogurt, is you drink it out of a little bottle. And it didn't matter. I didn't need the spoons particularly in the script. But if I had needed the spoons, I wouldn't have had them, and the artist would have had to go back and change the art, which, as you're well aware, is this super expensive thing to do.
Yeah, so like I said, not only is it language barriers, but it's also cultural barriers. What one thing means to somebody here in the U.S. means something completely different in another country, and then also you can also have things that are slang interpretations. So what could be innocuous word here is offensive somewhere else. So you always have to be careful.
Right,
but like
absolutely.
you said, international teams are becoming the norm.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I know several times I've worked where I'm writing in Colorado, there's an artist in Texas, and there's another artist in Los Angeles, and there's somebody else in California, and there's a letterer who's off in Massachusetts, and yeah. Well, gosh, okay. So the book right now is CLOCKWERX. It is a steampunk thriller about a detective from Scotland Yard who teams up with a woman who runs a team of Met pilots in Victorian London. I love her, by the way. She's such a fun character. The publisher is Humanoids. My guest has been Joe Witherington, and he's been talking to us about the challenges of comics, and particularly marketing comics today. Joe, thank you so much for being on. I really appreciate you being game enough to take all these bizarre questions, and I hope you have a fantastic evening.
Thanks again. And don't forget, if you want to check out the website, humanoids.com, and we've got the first half of CLOCKWERX available free to read until the end of September.
Outstanding. All right. Thank you very, very much. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.